Hi, thank you for joining me. Mindy Mandell here. So today I'm going to go on to talk about the dialogue Philebus. And this is actually the third video on the Philebus. If you haven't seen the first two, I do recommend you watch those first, so I will link them here. Now, the section that I covered last week ended with Socrates saying that he was going to go into what true pleasures are. He talked about what he saw as false pleasures, and he made that case, and I talked about that last week. Today, what he's going to do is show us what he sees as true pleasures. Now, to show us this, he's going to make a contrast. He says, now, wherever, in any case of this kind, a great quantity of pleasure is mingled, the small quantity of pain creates but a slight uneasiness. It's no more than what serves to tickle. While, on the other hand, the great excess of pleasure spread throughout convulses the whole frame and sometimes causes involuntary motions, operating also every change of color in the countenance, every variety of posture in the limbs, and every different degree of respiration. And within the soul it energizes and transports, uttered madly in exclamations. Entirely so, Protarchus says, so describing great pleasure. And he goes on to say that a person in such a condition is apt to say of himself, and others are apt to say of him, that he is dying, and as it were, through excess of pleasure. From this time forever after, he is wholly intent on pursuing the like pleasures, and the more so, the more he happens to be intemperate, and less under the government of wisdom. Thus he calls these pleasures the greatest, and accounts him the happiest of men who spends his whole time as far as possible in the enjoyment of them. So here he's describing somebody who desires more and more of this pleasure. And by the way, this is Thomas Taylor. All these translations are Thomas Taylor. He often used the word prudence to mean wisdom. The word has changed its meaning in modern English, so I included wisdom there. But here, what Socrates is describing is a person who is chasing desire, and many people feel that this is the ultimate freedom or the best life. We saw in the Republic that the tyrant is described this way, as a person who thinks they're acting out of freedom, but actually they're a slave to their desires. And in its extreme case, this would be like addiction. So this is the extreme case that Socrates wants to compare the true pleasures to. And he says that of all this, O Protarchus, this relates only to such pleasures mixed with pains as arise slowly in the body, in its superficial parts and interior parts alternately. And as to those feelings of the soul which meet with a contrary condition of the body, when pleasure in the one is mixed with pain in the other, so as that both are ingredients in one composition, we spoke of those before, such as desire of fullness under a sense of emptiness in the body, when hope administers delight, while the emptiness gives a pain. We did not indeed consider them at that time as evidence of the present point, but we now say that in all those cases, and the number of them is infinite, where the condition of the soul is different from that of the body, a mixture of pain and pleasure happens to be produced. So last week, we looked at cases where there's a pain in the body, such as hunger, and then a desire in the soul to eat. And so there's a certain pleasure that comes with that. Now what we're seeing is that there is a pleasure in the body, and the desire to continue it is what gives pain. But in both cases, there's a pain in one and a pleasure in the other. Now, among the mixtures of pain and pleasure, there is a third kind remaining, yet unmentioned. What kind is that? That where such pleasures and pains, as we said, arise frequently in the soul, herself by herself, and are mixed together. So now we're looking at only the soul itself, where both the pleasure and the pain are in the soul. And anger, fear, and desire, and lamentation, love, emulation, and envy, and all other such passions of the soul herself. Do you not suppose them to give pain and uneasiness to the soul? I do. And do we not remember in lamentations and desires the pleasures we have felt mingled with pains which those passions produce? It is true, Protarchus says, Our passions do affect us in the manner you've mentioned and no otherwise. So sometimes we not only feel pain, but we kind of wallow in our misery. We take a certain pleasure in that. And then Socrates gives another example. Have you not observed at tragic spectacles presented on the stage with how much pleasure the spectators shed tears? I certainly have. So we all love a good tearjerker. Our reasoning then shows, and oh yeah, he goes on then to give an example also of feeling certain pain or unhealthy desire when we are laughing at someone else in a comedy situation. Like our reasoning then shows that when we laugh at what is ridiculous in a friend, we're mixing thus delight with envy. And in those cases, we're mixing together pleasure and pain. For we acknowledged before that envy gives uneasiness and pain to the soul. And we've admitted that laughing yields delight. Now in these cases, they arise, both of them, at the same time. And so there are other examples of comedies as well as in tragedies. And so to wrap it all up, here's the conclusion. Socrates says, we see then from the conclusion of our arguments that in mournful spectacles, and no less in comedies, not only as they are acted on the stage, but as they are presented to us also in the tragedy and comedy of real life, and in 1,000 intermediate occurrences, pains and pleasures are blended together. And Protarchus agrees that it would be impossible, Socrates, for a person not to acknowledge this, even if he were so zealous an advocate for the opposite side. Now, in the course of that discussion, there was this one section that I took out. I wanted to give you that argument in whole without any interruption. But in the course of that discussion, what Socrates pointed out is that the reason that we feel both pain and pleasure at the same time in the soul is because of ignorance. And he's going to point out here 3 forms of ignorance. He says that whoever is ignorant of himself, must he not be thus ignorant in one or other of these 3 respects? What 3? First, with respect to external possessions, in imagining himself wealthier than he really is. And many persons there are who labor under this sort of ignorance. And then the second form of ignorance. Yet more numerous are they in the next place, who imagine themselves handsomer in their persons, or nobler in their air, or grace with some other corporeal advantage in a higher degree than actually they are. And very true, Protarchus says. But the number is by far the greatest, I presume, of such as are mistaken in themselves with respect to the third kind of excellence, that which belongs to the soul, by fancying themselves possessed of more virtue than in truth they have. And he says nothing is more certain. And indeed, no matter how rotten a person is, they seem to see themselves as good. Now, of course, all of these 3 ignorances, they also work in the opposite way, that insecurities can make us think that we are poorer than we really are, or less attractive than we really are, and so on. Among the virtues and excellencies of the soul is not wisdom, that to which the generality of mankind lay claim with the greatest earnestness, and in regard to which they are full of contention, opinionatedness, and false notions, and evidently so, Protarchus says. So now that we have looked at those mixed pleasures, we're going to proceed by a kind of natural necessity, Socrates tells us, to the several pleasures which are unmixed and pure. And here's where he's going to get into what he calls true pleasures. And Protarchus asks, what pleasures are those, Socrates, which a person would deem rightly of in supposing them to be true? The pleasures which are produced in us from seeing beauteous colors and beauteous figures, many pleasures also of the smell, and many others arising in us from the hearing of sounds. In a word, whatever pleasures we feel from perceiving the presence of anything whose absence we are insensible of, or at least occasions no pain in us, all these are unmixed and pure. It's not quite clear yet what he's talking about. Fortunately for us, Protarchus didn't understand either, and he asks also for an explanation. And here's what Socrates says. The meaning of it indeed is not directly obvious, but we must endeavor to make it evident. I mean then by beauteous figures, not as most people would suppose I meant, the beauty of living forms or their statues, but the straight and the round, whether in surfaces or in solids, according to which are fashioned the turner's works, and those of the carpenter by means of his rules and angles. For the figures which I mean, if you apprehend me, have no relative beauty, like those other beauteous forms, but in their own nature, separately considered, they're always absolutely beautiful, and the beholding of them gives us a certain peculiar pleasure, not at all similar to the pleasures excited in us by any kind of motion. So words like relative and absolute might remind you of the dialogue Statesman, where we saw the two standards of measurement. The relative standard of measurement is here in our physical world, where things are beautiful relative to other things. But in the world of being, in the intelligible world, there are the absolutes, things in themselves, beauty in itself, absolute beauty. And to measure against that, Socrates had said back in the dialogue Statesman, is the true measure, true way to measure, the true standard of measure. And so we're seeing that here as well, the idea that the true pleasures are not those that are relative, but those that are absolute. And when we behold these absolute realities, the type of pleasure we feel is nothing at all like the pleasures excited in us in our physical realm here. And he goes on to add to it the pleasures taken in the mathematical sciences, unless we're of the opinion that such pleasures are of necessity preceded by a thirst of learning them, in that when tasted and enjoyed, they raise a thirst of more and more, so that from our beginning to learn them, they are all along attended with uneasiness. So he's wondering if this raises the kind of desire that we saw at the beginning of this video, but Protarchus says no, not at all. Now, why does Socrates add the mathematical sciences? Well, here again is the divided line as presented in Book 6 of the Republic. Now, the things in themselves would be here on the divided line, the knowing, the noesis. The mathematical sciences would put us here. Back in the Republic, Plato had used geometry as an example of dianoia. And this was depicted in the allegory of the cave as when our ex-prisoner has turned away from the shadows on the wall, these levels here, where the impure pleasures are, and this person is now turned to see that sunlight coming in through the wide opening of the cave and is moving in that direction. So the person is not yet functioning at that higher energy of noesis, but they are focused on things in themselves, and so that also is being included among the true pleasures. Well, now then that we have tolerably well distinguished between the pure pleasures and those which are rightly called impure, let us further add these distinctions between them. And I did add the numbers just to make it easier to follow, because it's just a big chunk of dialogue otherwise. But the first one is that the vehement pleasures know not moderation nor measure, while those of the gentler kind admit of measure and are moderate. And the second point is that greatness and intenseness and the contrary qualities, the frequency also and the rareness of repetition, are attributes of such pleasures only as belong to the boundless genus, to that which is perpetually varying in its quantities and motions through the body and through the soul, while the pleasures to which the like variations never happen belong to the contrary genus and are allied to things wherein symmetry is found. Now, the idea of measure and symmetry is going to come up later in the dialogue, but here we do see the contrast from what we saw at the beginning of this video to what he's calling the true pleasures. Have we not heard it said concerning pleasure, that it is a thing always in generation, always produced anew, and having no stability of being, and cannot properly be said to be at all? And those are mostly the earlier types of pleasures that we saw. There is a kind of thing which is always for the sake of some other, and there is also a kind of thing for whose sake always is produced whatever has any final cause of its production. So Protarchus finds it hard to understand this, even though Socrates has already explained this a few times. This was the latest of these explanations. He's going to make it even clearer. So basically, there's something that is produced and something that is for the sake. It's produced for the sake of this. So we'll call those A and B without yet knowing what A and B are exactly. He says the generation of all things is one kind of thing, so what is produced, or the generation. And the being of all is a different kind. I admit your difference between being and generation. Now, this terminology should bring to mind this basic metaphysics that I've talked about in a few different videos now, that we can imagine the realms of reality being depicted by this triangle where reality as in its most unified form is at the point here, and reality as we experience it is down here at the bottom, its most differentiated form. And so here in our world of becoming or generation, we are in time and space and all the differentiation that implies. Beyond time and space, and this line here is separating that which is within time and space and that which is beyond it. And when we go beyond it, then we are also beyond the same level of differentiation that we have down here. And what he's saying now is that whatever is generated here is generated for the sake of what is here. Let's go on to see how he does this. Yes, I say then that for the sake of generation, it is true that medicines are composed, and the instrumental parts prepared by nature and all the materials of it are provided, but that every act of generation is for the sake of some being. Generation in every species for the sake of some being belongs to that species, and universally all generation for the sake of universal being. Most evidently so, Protarchus says. If pleasure then be of such a nature as to be generated always anew, then must not the generating of it be always for the sake only of some being? Without doubt. Now that for the sake of which is always generated, whatever is generated for some end, must be in the rank of things which are good, and that which is generated for the sake of any other thing must of necessity, my friend, be placed in a different rank of things. Certainly it must. Now, of course, all the realms of reality are good and right at their own proper power, but remember that the first cause of all is often called the good itself in the Platonic tradition, and the intelligible is sometimes called the good that is, because it's the first essence to follow from the good itself. And so the intelligible is, you might say, closer to the good, metaphysically speaking. That's what he's talking about here. Shall we not be right, then, in placing pleasure in a rank of things different from that of good, if it be true that pleasure has no stable being, but is always generated anew? And then Socrates gives some examples of irrational conclusions that would follow if we were to equate pleasure with good. He says, is it not highly irrational to suppose that a person afflicted with pain, without feeling any pleasure, should be obliged to say that evil only and no good was with him at the time when he was in pain, though he were the best of all men? And is it not equally absurd, on the other hand, to suppose that a person in the midst of pleasures must be during that time in the midst of good, and that the more pleasure the person feels, the more good that person is filled with, and is so much the better person? Well, all of these suppositions, Socrates, are absurdities in the highest degree possible. So now Socrates has now wrapped up his discussion of the pleasures, the false pleasures and the true pleasures. And then from next week, I'm going to wrap up the Philebus by looking at how he talks about the nature of wisdom and also the nature of the mixed life. And that's going to allow him to wrap up the conversation. As always, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below, or you can send me an email. There's an address in the description box. Also, if you like what you saw, I would appreciate a thumbs up. And as always, I do encourage you to please think about subscribing and also sharing these videos with your friends. Then you'll have someone to talk to them about. So I do hope that you will join me next week when we wrap up the Philebus. Thank you very much.